Dr. Peel. Okay, the hearing the hearing starts at 10, and that was what was conveyed to everyone.
My apologies.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to record that we should have started at 10. All right. How do you propose we proceed, Dr. Peel?
That was late because I think he mixed up the time, so it was on his way. But we could proceed.
Yes. All right. The way we've been... Sorry. So do you still want to say something?
No, just because of time constraint that we've delayed.
No, that's fine. But I need to take your... Are you going to be the presenter on behalf of HPCSA?
I will just do the introduction, but Dr. Quinda will do the full presentation.
Okay, that's fine. So both of you will be speaking?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, the way we've been running it is that we would take an oath so that the evidence you give can be factored into the record and our report writing. So if you don't mind then saying after me, I, and then your name.
I, Raymond Bila.
Swear that the evidence that I shall give.
Swear that the evidence that I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
Please raise your right hand and say, so help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you. And your colleague's name is?
Dr. Quinda.
Quinda. Yes. Okay. Dr. Quinda, I also need to take your oath now, and so that it's easy for you to speak later. Will you also say after me, I, and then your name?
I am Nyaziwa Quinda.
Swear that the evidence that I shall give.
Swear that the evidence that I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And please raise your right hand and say, so help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you. All right, so Dr. Pila, you can take us through your presentation then.
Yeah, thanks, Coach. I will just do the introduction to say that as the Health Professions Council of South Africa, what we're going to be presenting is purely based on the complaints that we have received from the public and from the practitioners. And because of our systems, we have not been able to look back the previous years. We'll only be looking at information that we have that we've collected this year. Dr. Pinda will go into detail about what we have. And the nature of the complaints that we have received have been categorized into the types of the complaints that we have. So it will be negligence primarily, it will be fraud, and also consultations. But I think Dr. Quinda will be able to take us through the whole lot as to what has happened. And we looked at the number of practitioners we have nationally, and then we also look at the type of complaints that have been presented. And then we look at the register that we have, because we keep a register. And the register that we keep is only for the people who have paid their annual the renewals for this financial year. It does not give us a complete picture of all the practitioners there. But the practitioners who are out there practicing should be registered with us. And if they are not registered, then they're practicing illegally. But I think that's just to give you. And we also look at where the practitioners come from, at which universities they've been trained. So that's the kind of information that we have. And then we also look at, because I think for the sake of this, not that we did it intentional, but I think that's what we have. It's looking at in terms of the profile, who are making the complaints. It's by race to look at who are the complainants, and then we look at and then types who are the people, the complainants, who are they complaining against in terms of the race. Then you also look at the medical aid schemes when they send complaints to us, and then you look at the categories in terms of the race that they presented. But I think Dr. Quinda will give us more detail as to when you look at the trends that we've picked up. But as I indicated, it is only for the first 2 quarters of this year. If need be, we may have to go back and drill down into what information we have over the previous years. But that will depend on the sophistication of the manner in which we can be able to get that information. Okay. So I think that's just in introduction. Nothing else. Ask Dr. Kwinda then. We unfortunately, we were not able to do a written presentation because I think there was a problem with information, the way we were contacted. We only became aware last week that we should be coming here. So we're doing an oral presentation, but I think what Dr. Kwinda will be doing is information that we look at in our quarterly reports based on because Dr. Kwinda comes from the legal and regulatory department of the HPCSA. So this is the information that he presents before the head of the department on a quarterly basis.
Thank you. Dr. Kwinda, you do have something in writing. So is it a PowerPoint presentation?
It's a PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, that's fine. So maybe you can leave that with us.
Yeah.
And then we will send you more specific requests for information in due course.
That's in order.
Thank you. As the registrar said, in the past, we were not collecting enough data, and we started the process of really collecting data at the beginning of this quarter that we can use for different purposes. And the presentation that I'm going to do is just a first quarterly report, and I will explain through the presentation as I go along. Now, that is in terms of just the complaints that we received in the first quarter, just to give you a picture of the number of complaints that we received between April and June this year. We had 603 complaints, and basically that is only in terms of our register. Now, when we look at the register of practitioners, which is currently sitting at 185,176, it's only 0.3% of our register, meaning that in the whole quarter, only 0.3% of the practitioners on our register have got complaints lodged against them. And out of that, because when complaints come, they are either mediated or they go for preliminary investigation.
Dr. Kwinda, sorry to interrupt. How many practitioners did you say are registered?
185,176.
So that's approximately 185,000 individual practitioners.
Yes.
Thank you.
And we are only talking about practitioners, not including interns or students. So students and interns are excluded from that number. So it's only those ones who are practitioners.
And apologies for interrupting again. And you said, your colleague said earlier, that you have the racial demographics of those practitioners. Is that correct?
Yes, we do.
Thank you.
So, Peter, that I doctored my quarterly report for this purpose and some of the information. I do have the other presentation though here in terms of the real numbers. So we'll leave it here later on. We could not save it on the memory stick, but we do have the figures in terms of how many practitioners per board and also per province across the country. So we have that information. I was still saying, out of the complaints that we received, there are those that we resolved before we registered them, but 63% of our complaints go for preliminary investigation process, whereas 32% go to the Office of the Ombudsman for mediation. How do we receive complaints? Most of the complaints, at 94%, we receive them through emails, and only 3% post, and then we've got 2.7% as walk-ins. Where do the complaints come from? Now, majority of our complaints are coming from members of the public, and what I have there is just the real numbers. It's not done in terms of percentage, but majority are coming from the members of the public, followed by the medical schemes, and then followed by other entities. And by other entities, we are referring, for example, to Office of Health Standard Compliance, or even the Consumer Commissioner. They also refer complaints to us. Then you have got those complaints that could not be mediated by the Ombudsman that will be taken back for preliminary investigation, and also We do have legal representatives submitting complaints on behalf of their clients. Then we have our inspectorate office that is enforcing compliance, that also feed into our complaints, and then other departments within the HPCSA. Now, in terms of the board...
Apologies, Dr. Kwenda, just to interrupt again so I understand correctly, and it's just because you're moving quite fast that I'm taking you back, but just a point of clarification. In relation to those approximate 185,000 practitioners, do you have a disaggregation of the number of those in private and public practice?
No, we don't have that. We don't have that. Now, I've not put a slide for the numbers in the boards, but what you have there now is the percentage of complaints per board. And the picture that we have there is that majority of the complaints that we receive are against the medical and dental professions, practitioners registered in the Medical and Dental Professions Board. That is where the medical doctors, the dentists, the medical scientists, and the clinical associates are in that particular board. And that is the second biggest board in council. And the other slide that you will get later will show you that. The biggest board in council out of the 12 professional boards is the Emergency Care Board, currently sitting with 57,000 practitioners in that board, followed by the Medical and Dental Professions Board, currently sitting with 54,000 practitioners. Then followed by the Psychology Board. Now, Psychology Board is the biggest of what we call the small boards, because from 54,000 in the Medical and Dental Professions Board, then the Psychology Board, which is now the third biggest board, is sitting at plus or minus 14,000 practitioners in that board. Then the rest of the boards follow from there.
Did you say 14 or 40?
For 14,000. 14, yes. Then the Medical Technology Board and the other board. Now, the smallest board in council is the Speech, Language and Hearing Professions Board. Now, in terms of the distribution of the complaints across the board, 76.6% of complaints are against the practitioners registered in the Medical and Dental Professions Board, and majority of them are medical doctors. We really don't have complaints against medical scientists, and very few complaints against clinical associates, who are very small anyway in the register, but majority are against the medical doctors in that particular board. Then you will see then 8.6% from that 76.6%, 8.6% are against practitioners registered in the Psychology Board, which is the third biggest board, whereas the biggest board, which is the Emergency Care Board, is sitting at 1.1% in terms of the complaints that we have received. And then I won't talk about the other boards, but you can see the rest follow. We don't have complaints against environmental healthcare practitioners. We hardly have. In the previous term of the board, the preliminary committee of inquiry for that board never met for 5 years, because there was never a complaint against any environmental healthcare practitioner for a period of 5 years. So they never met.
Tell me, do you break down the complaints by race?
Yes, I'm still coming to that.
Oh, you're still coming to that, okay.
Maybe should I rush there?
No. Take your time.
Maybe I should just mention, if I may,
Please.
I think if you look at the practitioners, I think we oversee a widespread of practitioners, and I think within the council, it's everybody else who's involved in healthcare except the nurses and pharmacists. So that information, you will not be able to pick it up from what we have here.
And a further point of clarification, because I think it's important that we understand your data before we start delving into some of the detail. Are your complaints, do you know if they emanate from public sector and private sector services, or is it a mix of public sector and private sector complaints?
Currently, we are not looking at that, but I can tell you from experience that majority of the complaints that we receive are from practitioners who are in private practice. We have got very few complaints really against practitioners in the public service. But I cannot tell, but from the experience of dealing with complaints, majority are from practitioners in the private sector.
And is that, sorry.
Yeah. Maybe if I were to add that, I think why it is so, it is because I've worked in the public sector for many years. So in the public sector, the complainants have an avenue of lodging complaints. They would then lodge the complaints within the hospital structures, and these complaints will be dealt with primarily. And only if they do not have a joy out of getting responses dealt with within the health sector, in the public sector, would then come to the HPCSA. But in the private sector, the first point of call, when anybody's got a complaint, they've got to go straight to the Health Professions Council. So I think there's a buffer in the public sector. That's why the complaints would not necessarily go straight to the Health Professions Council, because there is a place where these complaints can be dealt with.
I've been asking my questions partly because we have evidence from the Health Market Inquiry preliminary report that there are 14,951 practitioners. So that's where my line of questioning is coming from, just so I understand better. And it does seem that in the private sector, there's a far smaller proportion. If there's 185,000 doctors registered on your system, and there's only 14,000 odd in the private sector, then the vast majority of doctors are registered and practicing in the public sector. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I think you have to look at because the majority of the practitioners, we have specialists and general practitioners. And so in the public sector, you have people who are training, who are in the large majority. But I think because the public sector caters for almost 80% of the health population and 20%. But you find that the resources are a bit skewed. They're not in line with what is the service that is given. You find that the majority of the practitioners will then be working in the private sector rather than in the public sector.
Yes, absolutely. This is why I'm trying to understand this point. And let me just be more explicit. The health market provisional report says there are approximately 14,000 or 15,000. It is GPs. So my apologies, that it's GPs, not the whole. And now I see that you are actually listing every allied health professional, you including every doctor, every specialist, every allied health professional. Thank you.
Okay. Now we also look at the proportion of the practitioners against whom the complaints are lodged against the register. Now the picture changes when you look at the proportion now in terms of the size of each board, where although the Medical and Dental Professions Board is still sitting at 0.84 of the register in the first quarter, then you see now the Optometry and Dispensing Opticians Board also start to pop in now with the Psychology Board. Although the Psychology Board in the previous slide, if you remember, they were the second, but in terms of proportion, looking at the numbers in the register, the Optometry and Dispensing Opticians Board also comes up at the same level with the Psychology Board. And very interesting as well is that then your Assisting Dental Therapy and Oral Hygiene Board also comes up. And the smallest board, which is the Speech, Language and Hearing Professions Board, looking at the number of practitioners there, also come a little bit up. So that is in terms of the register now, in terms of the practitioners in that particular board. Now, we also look at the specialties across the Medical and Dental Professions Board. And this is my slide now. If you look, majority of complaints are against the GPs, followed by general surgery, and then the dentist really is not necessarily on, it's all the dentists, including the GPs in dentistry and also the specialists in dentistry. And then internal medicine, obs and gynae as well, then psychiatry there, and then anesthesiology. And really commonly in anesthesiology, I can tell you that commonly most of them are related to their fees, informed financial consent, because patients always say, I get a bill from this person that I never met in my life. because some of them meet anesthesiologists in theater. Those are the common complaints that we receive related to the fees that the anesthesiologists charge. So that is basically across the specialties in medicine, because you do have lots of complaints against the specialists. Then the provincial distribution of complaints now, the slide that is not there, which is on the other presentation, is that most of our practitioners are in Gauteng. That is, the majority of the practitioners are in Gauteng, followed by Western Cape, and then KZN, and then Eastern Cape, then Limpopo, and the rest follow. So even in the provincial distribution, you can see Gauteng is leading, then KZN overtakes Western Cape, because Western Cape has got second in terms of the majority of the practitioners, but when it comes to complaints, KZN overtakes Western Cape. And then Free State also overtakes Eastern Cape when it comes to the complaints that we receive. Then in terms of the proportion now of the register, in terms of where the practitioners are, then Gauteng is still leading, then followed by KZN. Then you start to see Northwest coming up with Free State, and Eastern Cape and Western Cape are at the same level now when you are looking at the register. So you can see that in terms of the numbers in the provinces, then Western Cape, although you have got fewer practitioners, but in proportion in terms of the complaints lodged against those practitioners, then they come at number 3 together with Free State. Now, this slide is very interesting. Here we look at the nature of complaints that we receive. Now, in the first quarter, the leading nature of complaint that we are receiving are related to negligence, and they are leading. Then the second one is related to accounts. And I will say that some of the matters related to account really is related to issues that if you were to go to issues of fraud, some of them have got an element of fraud in them. But fraud is the third highest nature of complaint that we are dealing with as counsel at the present moment. So then followed by matters of medical reports and communication, and then the rest follows. In terms of percentage, in our first quarter, 36% of our complaints were related to negligence, 16% related to accounts, and then fraud, which is the third highest, sitting at 12%. Then medical reports 8%, then communication 7%, and the rest follow.
What is the difference between accounts and fraud?
Matters of accounts include situations where a patient is not issued with a statement of account. For example, a practitioner can see a patient on a cash basis, but there's a requirement that they must issue a patient with a statement of account. Anyway, in terms of Section 53 of our Act and Section 59 of the Medical Schemes Act, it makes that provision that you need to issue a patient with a statement of account within a reasonable period. That is from our side in terms of the Health Professions Act, whereas the Section 59 also talks about the same thing, but Regulation 5 also prescribes how that statement of account has to be. We have cases where practitioners issue patients with invoices or receipts from the books that they buy from CNA. So they just write that the person has paid 300 rands, just like how that receipt book looks like. And it's not like a statement of account as prescribed in terms of Regulation 5 of the Medical Schemes Act. So you find that the schemes do not pay the member that consultation fee that they paid cash. And then the practitioners say, that is all I can give you. Then they come to us to say, the practitioner is not giving me a statement of account, then we deal with those matters. Most of these matters are dealt with in the Office of the Ombudsman. So that basically that is in the majority in terms of the accounts that practitioners have to issue to patients. Sometimes there's a delay. Sometimes what happens is that the statement is given to the patient very late. And sometimes it is when it is prescribed in terms of the number of days for the scheme to reimburse that particular practitioner.
So what about inaccurate information on an account? Where do you classify this? As an account query or as a fraud query?
It also fall into that as well. That's why I said earlier, that is where sometimes you pick up that in the accounts, and it also goes with the issue of billing as well. We found that, I'll give you a practical example. An anesthesiologist need to do a pre-anesthetic assessment before you put somebody to sleep. And the interpretation of that, you find that the patient says, I see pre-anesthetic assessment, but this person never came to the ward. They met me in theater. When did they do the pre-anesthetic assessment? Sometimes we have had cases where there is a particular procedure done, which is in the statement, but the patient says, but this was never done on me. But it is on the statement. So it's like the person is charging services.
Is that an account query or a fraud query?
That's why I said some of the matters that are categorized as accounts, you find that along the way they become fraud cases. Now, the picture I'm giving you here is what we capture at the receipt of the complaints. But as it goes along, as part of the investigation, you may realize that in fact this is not an account matter, it's a fraud matter. So some of the matters that are sitting at accounts, you may find that they may end up adding to fraud, and may find that fraud may end up becoming the second highest nature of complaint that we are dealing with.
Yes. I mean, I was also looking for coding complaints, and I don't see them. Yeah.
Usually they are part of the billing. Do I have billing there?
No, well, there's no billing either.
It means possibly they are sitting at accounts. We have not taken them as coding and billing. Usually we club them as accounts. But we do have cases where there are issues of codes, and that becomes a little bit tricky.
Dr. Gwenda, may I ask, just on this type of issue, like a coding complaint, how do you manage your regulatory role with the CMS and determine which complaints are appropriately dealt with by the differing regulatory bodies?
I didn't hear your question.
Well, let me take the example of accounts. You mentioned the Medical Schemes Act and what should be on the doctor's statement. Is this a complaint which is in effect a breach of the Medical Schemes Act? Is this a complaint that is considered by the HPCSA as unprofessional conduct?
Okay. Yeah, the issue here is the Medical Schemes Act prescribe how a statement of account should be. And if a practitioner registered with us does not comply with that, then the patient is the one who will suffer as a result. Because, as an example that I gave, if the patient pays cash and the practitioner issues a receipt which does not contain the information as prescribed in terms of the Medical Schemes Act, then the patient is not going to be reimbursed by the scheme. So that issue may not be within the ambit of the Health Professions Act, but in the practice of the profession, there are all these laws that impact on the practitioner. And the definition of unprofessional conduct in terms of the Health Professions Act is quite very broad. And if you go now into our ethical rules, we talk about you must act in the best interest of your patient. And if the best interest of your patient means that you must ensure that your patient is able to claim from their medical scheme, then if you don't act in their best interest, then we can hold you accountable. So it is on that context.
If I want to know the prevalence of coding disputes, where do I look on your table?
Unfortunately, you are not going to see it there. We have not captured that.
Doctor, as I understand it, the HPCSA also has a responsibility for monitoring ethical pricing, ethical charging by the members of your association, and whether it falls within your ethical tariffs. So, but I don't see that recorded here as a complaint. But if I misunderstand the legislation or the policy, then please tell me. My understanding was that a member of the public could complain to the HPCSA about basically overcharging, and there's a specific provision that makes provision for that. But I don't see it here.
I was just checking if we do have a nature called informed financial consent there. We only have got informed consent, but
does informed consent relate to?
But let me just explain in terms of section 53, which also says that the practitioner must inform the patient about the cost of services before they render the service. But when it comes to the issue of the tariff, that is where the board has to develop and publish the tariffs that are used by the board in a case where a patient inquires from the board if what they were charged is normal. So it's reasonable. So currently, that has not been done, and there is a history to that, which I hope if maybe we can give an opportunity for the president to be put on board so that he can also respond to some of the questions. It will also be helpful.
Maybe we should just introduce Dr. Ngcukaitobi as the president of the Health Professions Council and chairman of the Medical and Dental Board. I thought maybe we want to have some views on this matter. If you can just allow him to be part of the delegation.
I've met Dr. Ngcukaitobi in my previous life. Yeah. So, shall we just take your oath, Dr. Ngcukaitobi? So will you just say after me, I, and then your name?
Is the oath an only option?
No, sorry, there's an affirmation as well. Okay, would you rather do an affirmation?
I'd rather do an affirmation.
All right, so you the first, at least in this inquiry. All right, will you then say I and then your name?
I, Dr. Ngcukaitobi,
Solemnly affirm
that
the evidence that I shall give shall be the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
I guess I'd like to, the issue about the ethical pricing.
But you don't have to limit yourself to the questions. So.
Yeah, but I'll start with the question. It's a thesis and answer to the question. The misnomer of ethical pricing dates back to around 2008, where there was a departure of negotiated settlements. When the Competitions Commission came in and said there was collusion in terms of the way tariffs were set, it created an impasse in terms of tariff creation. You then had an inability for the professions to come together because they were considered to be colluding. The medical aids could not come together, they were considered to be colluding. The hospitals could not come together, so no service providers to come and negotiate tariffs. You then ended up with a void for a few years about tariffs. The department then tried to step in to create tariffs, and they created the National Reference Price List, which after it had engaged, and it was difficult because at the time I was with the association, we couldn't freely participate because we had just been, in our opinion, defrauded to close on R1 million by the Competitions Commission on a fine for collusion when we were doing a civic duty. There was great difficulty in terms of getting exemptions so that we could come and talk about issues of tariffs. But be that as it may, a national reference price list was created. It was then challenged by parts of by the industry, and it was negated by the courts. So there was no pricing. Then at that time, the council at the time, through the registrar at the time, decided to adopt the national reference pricing list that came from the department as an ethical price list. There was then confusion inside the organization because there were differing opinions. Because when you're talking about access to healthcare, how can pricing healthcare be considered ethical? So that created confusion. And I think that's where your issue of an ethical price list comes from. So it was born out of a decision that was made by a council that had no reference. Now, prior to the issue of the ethical price list, what was happening before the intervention of the Competitions Commission was that there was a statutory body called Representative Association for Medical Schemes, REMS. Now, REMS was mandated to negotiate on behalf of schemes, tariffs. The Medical Association represented the medical doctors, but there were other associations representing other practitioners. The association created codes for the different procedures. And anytime there was a new procedure, there would be a process inside the association to look at whether is there scientific proof, is it part of common clinical practice, or is it experimental. A code would then be created in terms of the criteria that were used, about the difficulty, the resources, etc. And there would be units apportioned to it, and there'd be a rent value at the end. So what happened historically was when the Medical Schemes Act was originally acted upon in 1967, through time, the Medical Association was recognized as the negotiator for the profession. And because of that, there was a medical association rate that was determined in accordance with a complex process that occurred inside the medical association. Now, that process depended on intellectual property that was borrowed from the Americans, called the Clinical Procedural Terminology, CPT, and it was licensed to the Medical Association. That was the basis of creating billing codes in South Africa. So what would then happen was that there would be a medical association rate, but the medical schemes would then come and say, we want a discount. And they created what they called a scale of benefits. So there was a rate, what was called a medical schemes rate. And the conditions were fairly simple at the time. As a practitioner, you could contract in or contract out. If you contracted in, it means you are agreeing to charging the scale of benefits that has been determined by the Representative Association of Medical Schemes. Initially, it was negotiated, but with time, because of not finding each other on a pricing point and no mechanism of an agreed tariff, what was created was a scheme of tariffs where there was the medical association rate, then the schemes would discount it for themselves, and they would create a scale of benefits, or the REMS rate, and the workman's compensation would come in and go to a midpoint between what REMS would put up, what the association had put up, and they created a rate for injury on duty. That is what was happening historically. And it was always accepted that codes can only come through a strict process that started with the medical profession. Because, funders or handlers of funds don't know what happens inside a profession. And that had been the process. So when a procedure had not been coded, it could not be paid for by the schemes because it had not been paid for. But there was a process of agreeing to that issue. And that's where the issues of the codes come in. And there was a battle historically about who owns the codes at some point. But that's the background about the tariffs that were there. So you had a scenario where there was a statutory tariff, and all medical aid paid in accordance with the statutory tariff. So on the eve of liberation, pre-94, the then minister dismantled the system, in the sense that in the previous system, care to patients were guaranteed and payment to providers were guaranteed as long as it was in accordance with the scale of benefits that were determined and with other scheme rules that applied. That was taken away. Care to members was not guaranteed and payment to providers was not guaranteed. So you then had the era where medical aid, despite it being declared a not-for-profit business, it then began to run like insurance models, and it created the scenario that you have today, where the only time as a member of the medical aid you guaranteed care is if you don't get sick. If you get sick, your problems begin. And there's no protection in the law. And the power of the CMS was eroded from beginning of the medical schemes being allowed to create as many options as they have. Remember, before it was fairly simple. For a procedure, I'm an ophthalmologist. A cataract would have a scale of benefit rate, there'd be a medical association rate. Now, in terms of the duty of counsel, it was to adjudicate when there are complaints about fees. And it needed to have references that it could refer to in terms of doing that adjudication. Now, the process had always been knowledge of the different tariffs that exist, that there's a scale of benefits, there's an injury on duty, and there's a medical association rate. And the approach of the regulator was that the medical association rate was seen as sort of a maximum that you could charge. That's what the profession feels the procedure is worth. This is what the medical aids feel they could pay. And this is the midpoint for counsel for medical schemes. So you would take all those tariffs into consideration when adjudicating. There was never an issue of which tariff was ethical. But there was a tariff plateau that which you could refer to. But the regulator itself has never had the ability to create tariff. It's also never been the duty of the regulator to create the tariff, because if you created the tariff, you'd be controlling the market. You'd be creating a straitjacket. And you can no longer adjudicate on complaints about tariff because you have your own tariff. That would take you out of the equation in terms of those complaints. So that's the matrix that was used. So I hope I've tried to explain where the ethical misnomer comes from.
I mean, just to take you beyond the ethical, I mean, I'm sure at some point we need to explore that. We've had evidence in the past 2 days that currently there is complete confusion about the appropriate tariffs. And that confusion emanates from a ruling made by the Competition Commission, right? What is your experience about? I know you're coming here as HPCSA, but maybe you can also enlighten us in relation to your broad experience in the industry about the impact of the absence of a standard tariff that will be charged by everyone, and everyone will know when you are outside a particular range of a tariff.
Yeah,
I mean, my understanding is that there are 3 numbers. There is a number you get when your own doctor charges you, and that's your rate you negotiate with your doctor if alternatively the doctor imposes it. And then there is a medical aid tariff, and then there is a tariff that is in the reference price list, which you may or may not comply with. And the fact that there are 3 different numbers is causing immense confusion within the industry.
I think causing confusion would probably be considered the biggest understatement of the century. It has actually destroyed the private sector. It has destroyed the ability for populations to be protected if they have cover, because they currently don't know what they're covered for. It doesn't matter how well educated you are. Even if you are in health like myself, you really don't know what you're covered for until you get sick. And there are disclaimers, and you have to sell this and sell that to cover costs. And that's what this has created. And the only victors out of this are administrators.
Dr. Lehlapi, we heard yesterday, we heard yesterday from one of the witnesses, I think from the BHF, who said that the difference between the various, let's call them tariffs, is actually immaterial. So effectively how I understood this witness was the difference is being overplayed, particularly in relation to not necessarily the amount, but in relation to the description of the procedure. How would you respond to that?
I would say I'm not surprised that it comes from BHF. I'd be surprised if they gave a more ethical answer, because I don't think they can spell the word ethical. That would be my response to it. Now, Let me illustrate why rates matter. If you come as a patient and you're covered or you're not covered, you need to know what the procedure is worth, what it is going to cost you. Now, they say it doesn't matter because that's where their power lies. It's in the uncertainty. Because it doesn't matter. As a member, you don't know what you are entitled to. There is nothing that you are entitled to because nothing is prescribed. All that you are told is within scheme rules. They can meet overnight and change things, and those are the scheme rules that are applicable. And the scheme rules are written such that even those that write them don't understand them. They are written such that they are not comprehensible, at least not to an average doctor like myself. Now, each scheme can create its own tariff. So there isn't an agreed tariff that's called a medical aid rate. So this medical aid can change it by 10 cents, that by 10 rand, that by 15 rands, but it's a scheme rule because there's no overarching scheme rule. And a scheme can have 100 options. So under one scheme, you don't actually know what their tariff is. The same scheme will tell you, depending on which sector you come from, will pay 3 times the medical scheme rate. Now, what has happened is that there used to be a scale of benefits, but it was left behind when the Competitions Commission interfered. There was an NRPL which could not be promulgated because it was challenged. So what people have done, they've taken that NRPL, adjusted it for inflation, and they say they have a scheme rate. But there's no law that says what you must do. So you can do anything that you want. You can adjust it by inflation, you can adjust it by zero, you can deflate it, you can do anything that you want because there are no rules. It's the scheme rule that matters, and the schemes can come up with anything that they want. Now, the issue of lack of tariff has created uncertainty throughout the industry. The only people that are certain...
I don't want you to move on just before I understand. I completely understand what you're saying in relation to tariff, that the power is with the schemes. That is your evidence. Just so I understand, because the evidence again, and it's an important distinction, I think, because there's a difference, as I understand it, in the RPL and the old ethical tariff and the scheme's own tariffs. There's both a procedure code component and a tariff component. So there's a question about quantum, what a doctor can charge, and a question about whether they've accurately described the procedure that they've performed or the service they've given. So the evidence yesterday, as I understood it, and I'll be corrected if I've understood it incorrectly, was that in relation to the procedural descriptions, there is not much difference between all these different codes, put it that way. The reference price list, the scheme's own RPLs, for want of a better word. So the evidence was that in terms of how you describe your service, there's not much difference. So, and that goes to this coding issue where there's a coding complaint about a doctor.
That might be true to a certain extent. A cataract is a cataract. A cataract removal is a cataract removal. So if you have a code 3047, which is for cataract removal, in a particular manner, extracapsular manner, or 3045, intracapsular manner, or 3049, phaco, that's just a descriptor for a procedure. So the codes will remain the same. The slight difference might come when there's a new way of doing that thing, and you need to create a new code. You know, I'll give you, we used to take out cataracts using a cryoprobe, taking the lens hole, and we gave you thick glasses. We were then able to leave something behind, put a lens in, scrape it out, and pull it out. We're now able to use a small incision, break it up, and suck it out. We may in future be able to do it with laser. So you'll create different codes for those issues. But if you've described that I've taken a cataract this way, it will be common throughout.
Whose control is that within?
Well, those are professional duties. Those are professional activities. And traditionally, in the organized system, before it was destroyed, it was the preserve of the profession. Because it's in the professions that treatments are made available, that advances are made. That's the practice of medicine. speaking as a medical doctor, but not confining it to that. It could be the practice of psychiatry or practice of optometry. That's a professional domain. But what has happened right now is that we've created a monster that thinks it can also practice medicine and decide who does what, and decide that this that the profession says it's going to do is not acceptable. But that is a professional domain that, unfortunately, because of the terrain in the country, you have people that have never seen a door of a medical school, that have deprofessionalized the professions and are dictating to the professions what should happen at a professional level. Go back to what I said. Originally, the Medical Association coordinated that. So if there was a new procedure, it would then be debated in the right fora as to whether is it standard, is it experimental, has it become normative, etc.
So
that has been destroyed.
has SAMA stopped doing that?
SAMA can't do it because they'll be colluding. So if they're doing it, the Competitions Commission will be charging them. So if they are doing it, they are breaking the new laws.
Dr. Ngcukaitobi, one of the reason we are here is because of there are two things. One is the complaint by the funders of fraud, waste, and abuse. And they define those terms, fraud, waste, and abuse, and that includes over-servicing, over-utilization of services by members, broadly speaking. That's the one thing. The other is the complaint that in the process of investigating fraud, waste, and abuse, the funders are discriminating against black practitioners. Why the codes and the tariffs and where we started off is important is because in order for there to be a determination that there has been over-servicing, and I guess I'm also more interested in that aspect of fraud, waste, and abuse, the W and the A, because fraud often is quite easily identifiable. But it might be, and I'm testing the proposition with you, it might be more difficult to determine where overutilization amounts to abuse or not, or over-servicing. If there is no agreement about the tariffs, if there isn't a standard, if there isn't some anchor that you can refer to say, well, it doesn't have to be this, but there's a guideline. So what is your response to that? The complaint and the relevance of the tariffs to the complaint, that in order for the funders to control waste and abuse, they need to investigate it, and they investigate it with reference to something. What is the thing that they reference against, or should they reference against? And the second is your comment and your response to the allegations that when the funders do these investigations, that they do so in a manner in which they racially profile practitioners.
That's a tough one, but I will attempt to provide an answer. Now, firstly, one man's food is another man's poison. So when they talk about fraud, waste, and abuse, they need to define what they mean. And clearly, there are elements of that throughout the system, from the administration side, from the provider side, from the patient side. All those issues occur. Historically, admin fees were at some point limited to 2%. It rose to 4%. It can now hit 20, 25%. That's a fraud, waste, and abuse on its own. But nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about proper bills that are legit, that go unpaid, that may far exceed the amounts that we talk about in terms of fraud, waste, and abuse. So there's an essence where they say the victor writes the history. So it's a question of who says it. So when they say it, we as practitioners will look bad. And when we say it, we'll expose them for what they are. And I think that should be taken into account. You go globally, there's no way where administering a system should cost more than 5%. Why are we into the levels that we are at? And that's not considered waste, abuse of power, and in a sense, systematic, organized fraud legitimized by an act of parliament. So for me, I think we should look at this broadly. Now, it does not mean there aren't issues of fraud amongst practitioners. But what I find fascinating is that every time they target a person, they do it unlawfully. And when they catch them, they go to an agreement with the person of repayment. And by the time they refer it to the regulator, you are dealing with a poisoned chalice where evidence has been obtained unlawfully. But people have already made deals. Now, you tell me, who's the biggest fraudster? When you catch people and you put them back on your patients and you compromise the regulator from doing their job properly. Where you are doing things that are unlawful. We've spoken to them, we said, why don't you go to the NPA? We have a collective duty to get rid of fraudulent practitioners. But you can't have somebody that has might acting unlawfully, intimidating. And the problem is that when you look at their positive rate, it's much lower than how they cast aspersions. Now there's the issue of the racial profiling. It's a systems issue. Now here's the beauty. If you stay outside and you're dealing with a population that can pay out of pocket, and you say to them, this is what I charge, it might be 4 times the NRPL list, and the patient knows the patient pays, you then have an issue where this issue of fraud, waste, and abuse doesn't come in. But in the absence of agreed tariffs, they then come and use whatever they want to use and accuse you of fraud, waste, and abuse. Where they've taken out peer review as used to happen. Where they've taken out coming to the profession and saying, your member is an outlier, and here's the evidence for the outlier, so that the profession can deal with it, because you are alleging improper professional conduct. But it is not even left to the profession in terms of associations or the regulator to deal with. It's being dealt with by the funder in the funder's interest, not necessarily in the patient's interest.
So your proposal is that the way it should be investigated is first to refer it to the health professional, or whichever is a professional body that the practitioner belongs to first do that.
No, I'm saying, even if you don't do that first, whatever you do as an administrator, follow the laws of the country. We are not saying if you think this practitioner is billing 5 million rands a month, he should be working 30 hours a day, which is not possible, that medical aid should not investigate that. But what we are saying is they need to go to the NPA, put up a case so that it's legit, it's watertight, it's legal.
But it
so that
might
when
take...
they do a sting operation, it's authorized in terms of the laws of the country. So we are not saying they can't do what they do, but they can't be a law unto themselves.
All right. Just to finish up the question that my colleague, Ms. Williams, was asking around coding. Now, my understanding around the issue of coding is we can look at it as 2 aspects. The one is coding in respect of medical procedures, and the second is coding in respect of actual tariffs. So on the first one, medical procedures and time, you say ordinarily that should be the responsibility of the profession because they have the expertise. But in reality, because of the absence of regulation, that power is exercised by schemes. On the second one, you're saying the determination of the tariff, ordinarily that should be the function of the regulator. But because of the weaknesses in the regulatory system, it ends up being exercised by schemes. And so there is the over-concentration of power on the schemes, both on clinical issues really, and also on tariff determination, which are regulatory issues.
Can I rephrase it?
Yeah.
the schemes are overstepping their boundaries.
Yeah.
It should never be because there isn't this, they can do that. Because the fact that there is no statutory tariff does not mean there is no proper practice of medicine. Does not mean there are no advances in medicine where new procedures need to be coded. And that is not the forte of a funder. The duty of a funder would be to say, do its due diligence of saying, is this accepted practice? Is this experimental? Are we going to pay for it or not pay for it? That becomes their jurisdiction. But they cannot say because they are not paying for it, it's not a proper procedure. That's beyond their pay grade. But because they have the mind, they cross in the boundaries. Now, what you do is, once you have coded procedures, it's up to the scheme whether they'll pay for them or not. You know, just like we can code a liver transplant, but you can then decide on the resources available, we can't give the benefit of a liver transplant. You know, we can't give renal transplant, we'll pay for dialysis. Dialysis will be coded, a renal transplant will be coded. And it's not your duty as a funder to code it. But it's for you to look at, within the pairs that we have, these are the services that you're going to provide. What you then do is based on the codes, which will be weighted in accordance with complexity by those to whom it belongs, which is the medical profession. For example, we'll put relative unit values. We'll say a cataract is 10 units, brain surgery is 100 units. What funders then do is that, okay, our conversion factor, and the job was simple before. They'll come up with what they call a rand conversion factor. We're paying 10 rands per unit. Injury on duty pays 15 rands a unit. SAMA says it's 30 rands a unit. So you are able to code, to convert the codes with the units into a tariff. Yeah. But your duty as a funder is on the side of conversion to tariff, not on deciding on the codes. You can also have a duty to decide what you pay for and what you don't pay for. But it's not your duty to say this is appropriate or not appropriate. That's a professional domain.
Dr. Letlachwi, let me just ask another question on this point, because I mean, as you can see, the panel is grappling with it. It's not clear to me why the professional associations, who are the doctors, can't make some recommendations in relation to the procedural codes, so the description of what should be done, let's say, or could be done. Could you respond to that? Because I certainly didn't understand the Competition Commission, who gave evidence on the first day, and on this point it was brief, I do admit, but I didn't understand their ruling from 2004 to mean there couldn't be some agreement on these descriptors, so to speak. I understood their ruling to be there shouldn't be any agreement on price.
Remember, I alluded to the fact that the way the association operated was we have a contract with the American Medical Association. And medicine is universal and global. So those things are not unique to South Africa. So when there are new procedures, they'll have codes for procedures that we have not even considered doing here. And when we use the CPT framework, which they update on a constant basis, you'll have the new codes for the new procedures that exist. It's then a question of, are these treatments available in our setting? For example, if you have robotic surgery for prostate cancer, would have been available elsewhere before it was available here, but the code would have existed in terms of it being coded. So we'll be able to look at it, bring it in, and be able to look at our matrix. So the answer is yes, societies can code. But what has happened is that people have used their might to say, we don't accept that code. And they've used it to rubbish those procedures and tarnish reputations of professionals. Just like when the ethical myth came up, they then tell their members that doctor is not charging an ethical tariff. So that doctor is not ethical. So there's a gross abuse of power and an asymmetry. Now here's the key issue. The key issue is about direct payment. This is the problem. In the old system, there were tariffs published, you're contracted in, you'd get direct payment, and you'd work according to the tariff. Now, being paid depends on the mood of the administrator. You get no legal right to be paid by the funder, irrespective of how you behave or what you do. You can do everything correct, and they send the money to the patient. Now, this is an issue about direct payment. Now, the issue of profiling
would
is
an exception to that? Would an exception to that be the designated service provider? Because there you
no, it's not an exception. It's abuse. It's further abuse of power, where you decide as a medical aid which doctor is going to live and which one is going to die. That's an abuse of power, because you see, the initial system was open and fair. These are the tariffs. Are you in or are you out? Patient choose your doctor. Now, it's administrator choose the doctor. So people will be moved from Soweto with a designated provider in Kempton Park. All the other issues about taxi fare, how you get there, a relationship with something you don't know, language barriers, they are mute. So our rules are being violated, where actually medical aids are stealing patients from practitioners, planting them with other practitioners, what we call supersession. Why? Because they can. DSPs are uncompetitive, unlawful, unethical, and discriminatory. And they should not be allowed. Because you are taking away the choice of the patient, you are deciding which doctors live, which doctors don't live. Now, this will tie up to the issue of the racism that you are alleging. Now, when you go into the realities of people, I mean, I've been in private practice for more than 30 years. And I know where my patients come from. I mean, some of them, the medical aid contribution is a big chunk of their salary. They don't have spare cash to pay me. So I find it unethical to have someone sitting in front of me whose circumstances I know, who's now battling for taxi fare because it's the 9th of the month, and I want them to pay me up front. So what happens is that most black practitioners, African and Indian, would be working with a customer base in that position. So what do? They are dependent on payment directly from medical aid. What happens? They are the ones that get victimized. Now, the people from affluent communities are not affected by these issues. They have, tap machines, swipe machines. You pay before you are seen, or you pay before you leave. They don't have creditors. They don't send accounts, and they are not impacted by this behavior of medical aid. Now, it even extends to issues of just racial profiling. It also extends to demeaning the profession, asking for confidential information, using some act from the Medical Schemes Act that says, if I pay you directly, I can have access to that information. And that information is not used in the interest of the patient. They want to use that information to deny care to their member. They are not using it to provide them with care. And they want the provider to be an accomplice to harming the interests of the patient. And how do they do it? Dependence on direct payment. Now, if you're an affluent practitioner that does not take payment from them, that takes it directly, they can't access that information. So this is where the racial profiling is basically about the demographics of the country, about the history, and about the situation of people. So whether you call it racial profiling or not, but what they do will affect black practitioners in general and black patients in particular.
Can we do this? Can we get to the mundane business of facts and figures? And then we will come back to Dr. Dehlape once we have finished. I know that we took you off track, so you can blame the panel for this.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. I think, because I think in the council, I think we're more into the administrative part of the business, and we give you the facts as we see them. And it is up to the investigation team to determine what they mean. And I think more as they are, and I think that's what we'll do. Sure.
Thank you. Let me continue with my presentation. Now, I'm about to finish, and here now we are also showing you our register in terms of the race. So I think it talks to the last question that was asked now. The majority of our practitioners are African, followed by whites, Indians, colors, and of course those who are...
What is unknown?
They are confused about their race, I think so. And then the Chinese. What it simply means is that on the register, they did not indicate their race.
It's not a race per se.
Now, in terms of percentage...
Sorry, can you just go back to that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, of the doctors, because that's 87,000. So just on the doctors, what are the figures?
We have not zoomed into specific boards and specific professions. What we are just showing in terms of the register in general. Should I move on?
So these are GPs and specialists and
These are
clinical psychologists?
Yes, all the professions registered under the Health Professions Act.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, is that it might be distortive if you don't isolate GPs, for instance, where we know on the facts that the largest number of complaints by schemes are directed at doctors.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm looking at zooming into
of course,
that.
Yeah, of course, this is the first time that we are extracting this data.
Yeah.
And we can go as deep as we can
Yeah.
for a particular purpose.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
it might
but
be
that's
helpful.
what we have at the present moment.
Yeah, it might be helpful that you actually do that deep dive, so that we get a proper picture of what the figures look like. Because
Yes, okay.
on what we have been told without data is that basically in this country the racial spread of doctors is overwhelmingly white, but the racial spread of complaints then becomes black.
Yeah.
And that's the basic fact we've been told. And so you are the persons who have the stats, who can help us to know whether that's true or not.
Okay. So basically, that is our
Dr.
register.
Quinto, would you be willing to make your raw data available to us so that we can work with it as well?
The what?
Certainly not the three of us, yeah, but would you be able to make the raw data available to us?
In fact, I have it here with me, and I can give it to the Secretariat, then they can work on it. It's our register as of the 3rd of June, 2019.
Thank you.
So we can share that with the Secretariat, and they can use it whichever way they want.
Yes.
Now, in terms of percentage, 50% of our register is African practitioners, and 30% is white, 9.4% is Indian, 6.8% is colored, 3.8% is the unknown, and Chinese is 0.2%. Now, we go into complaints. Now, I'm giving you the figures as of May to June because that is when we started. You know, when these issues of racial profiling started, we started now to profile as well from our side, from the complaints that we receive. And we started doing that in May 2019. And this is the picture that we have in terms of the numbers now. Majority of the complaints we have received in those 2 months were against white practitioners, who are 30% of the register, then followed by Africans and then Indian and colored. Now, in terms of percentage, while African practitioners are 50% of the register, then the whites, who are almost 30%, then shoot in terms of the complaints registered against them to 50%. Of course, we still have to dive in terms of the nature of complaints per race. We are still going to get to that. So this is just the information that we are gathering, and whenever we gather information, then it makes us think, let's dive deeper, which we are going to.
Where are these complaints from?
The complaints, I will show you. It's a period that for now, I've only picked up the ones of fraud, which I'm going to demonstrate, but we have not gone deep into. Now, when we look at the general complaints against Africans, where are they coming from?
Yes, now, you see, remember that I think in slide number 2,
yes,
you showed us that the sources of complaint could be members of the public.
Yes, that's true.
And which is the largest proportion. But that's immediately followed by schemes.
Yes.
Now, what I want to know is, of the complaints you've shown here per race, how many come from the members of the public and how many come from schemes as against white or black?
On general complaints, we have not dived into that. We only dived into issues of fraud for now. I have that slide that will show that information. Now, in terms of the proportion, in terms of the register, then it shows us that the whites and the Indians are at the same level when you look at the register, in terms of the complaints lodged against them. And the Africans are at 0.2, which is almost half of the whites and the Indians. And the colored are 0.002, and the Chinese is 0. Now, this now is fraud. And it talks to what picture do we see as a regulator from the issue of racial profiling. Now, we looked at the source of complaints of fraud, and the picture says, if you look at members of the public, they reported 5 African, 5 Indian, and 11 white practitioners. But the medical schemes reported 25 African, 3 Indian, and 1 white. Our inspectorate office, 2 African, legal 2 African practitioners, 2 African. Now, this is the picture we are giving you from what we have collected between May and June, and it's up to you to interpret it.
And you could do the same exercise over a longer period.
What we are thinking of doing, we're going to be doing this, of course, from May, and we're going to see how far back can we go in terms of gathering information like this. But I can promise you that moving forward from May, we are gathering information like this.
But you will be able to do a retrospective?
We want to explore if we can, from the data that we have been collecting, if we can go retrospective. But this is what we captured from May.
For 2 months?
For 2 months. That is the picture. We leave it to you to interpret it.
Yes, but look, what we would like, I'm not going to do interpretation now, but what we would like is that a realistic time frame is probably 2016 up to now, if that is possible at all. That's the realistic time frame if you look at the complaints that are within our scope of investigation.
Okay.
It's 2014.
Well, I think we accept that.
My colleagues are respectively, one is saying 2014, the other is saying 2012. I think we should probably stick with 2016.
Yeah, I think understanding our capacity, we would respectfully request that perhaps we only go back as far as 2016. Ask
for resources.
Well, yeah. Well, if the resources are available, we would appreciate that. I would try to make a link, without influence. But I think if you listen to what Dr. Netape said about the nature of the patients who go to practitioners, and you look at the data that we have, it tends to tie in very well, because with the nature of the people who may be going to a particular practitioner and whether they, in terms of the tariff and the complaints. The second factor that we may also look at, we have not looked at, maybe look into the public sector, what happens, is who are most likely to complain in our population. And I think it's, even looking at the data that you have in other areas, that the white patients are most likely to complain compared to the black patients when it looks at the delivery of healthcare, receiving of their healthcare services. But I think this picture is quite interesting to look at it as the way it is, because we need to also look at is it the black patient complaining against the black patient, the white patient against the white patient, practitioner. So that's information that we thought we should look at in the source of the complaints when you look at that.
Why do you say white patients are more likely to complain?
That's what I'm saying, that when you look at, because I think in terms of their empowerment, in terms of their...
It's because of what levels of education?
That could be the factor also.
Levels of affluence.
Affluence, yeah.
And then when you compare that to sort of black clientele, they're less likely to be aware of their rights.
Yes, yeah.
Because of their socioeconomic circumstances.
Yes,
I see. But how does that tie up to the fact that there is a huge disparity between complaints originating from members of the public and complaints originating from medical aid schemes?
That's what I'm saying, that's a compound that one should look at, to say if we have that understanding, we should now look at the nature of the...
Because,
the
presumably the schemes have all of the resources to complain. It's not as if there is a power dynamic that's influenced by socioeconomic background.
Yeah. What I'm saying, the complaints that we receive from the public, but I think if you compare with what is happening there.
Yeah, all right. I get you.
Yeah, I think that is my last slide, but there's just something else that, of course, I cannot be able to share this information, but it's very much linked to some of the investigation that we are doing, where you remember the issue of the global fees a few years ago, and we were involved in that, but there are also other issues that are coming up in some of the investigations that we are doing. There's an investigation that we are doing currently where we have picked up issues that we have got questions in terms of the Medical Schemes Act. And that deals with some of the entities that are performing the functions of managed healthcare organizations while they are not necessarily accredited under the Medical Schemes Act by the Council for Medical Schemes. And that has come up in terms of now they are contracting with practitioners and where there are payment arrangements between these entities where they will contract with the scheme and the entities will then negotiate prices with the practitioners. And it talks to what Dr. Hlabe was talking to earlier on. But some of our investigation, and I do have a report currently, although because it's a Section 41 investigation that we are doing about these entities, that shows that indeed the entity is not accredited by the Council for Medical Scheme, and we have got information from the Council for Medical Scheme to that point to say this entity is not accredited. But they say to the practitioners that they contract with, we are a managed healthcare organization. But when you look at the fact that they are not accredited by the Council for Medical Schemes, meaning that the schemes are contracting with them while they are not accredited as a managed healthcare organization, and practitioners, because they depend on these entities for the benefits of their members to claim for them, then it becomes a challenge. So that is what we have also picked up, and I think looking at our processes, we can be able to share that information with you later on, because we are asking ourselves, why are these entities allowed to be contracting with the schemes and ultimately contracting with the practitioners registered with us, while, if you look at it, they are not accredited in terms of the Act.
Do you have the names of the schemes for May and June 2019 who have lodged these complaints that are in column 2?
We can get that information for you. That will be easy to get.
A further question about your data. I see that you've reported on complaints, but of course the Health Professions Council makes findings in relation to the complaints. There will be a determination of whether there's professional misconduct or not. So do you have data on what happens to the complaints? Are there ultimate findings and the same data in relation to those findings, in other words, a breakdown on in terms of racial demographics?
Yeah. Currently, we don't have data that I could present the way I'm presenting this data. But now, moving to the aspect, this is now from Secretariat, then we move to the aspect of our governance structures in terms of our preliminary committees of inquiry and also our professional conduct committees. And I don't have the data that we have already collected in terms of what happens. What I can just tell you is that in terms of the preliminary committees of inquiry and the professional conduct committees, what we have currently introduced, because we have picked up a challenge, and the challenge that we have picked up is that you have practitioners who are found guilty of unprofessional conduct at a preliminary committee of inquiry related to issues of fraud. And the matters are finalized in preliminary inquiry level. And our preliminary committees of inquiry are limited in terms of the penalties that they can impose. In terms of our Act, You have got penalties that range from caution, reprimand, fines, suspension, and also restitution. But the preliminary committee of inquiry is limited to only a caution and a reprimand and a fine. They cannot go to restitution, meaning that if somebody is found guilty of fraud, for example, and the preliminary committee of inquiry finalized the matter, even if there could be restitution where the person could be forced to pay the money that they've defrauded, that cannot happen at that level because only a professional conduct committee can impose a penalty of restitution. Now, we have developed also guidelines even for our governance structures to say if there's a case of fraud, it's better that the matter is not finalized at a preliminary committee of inquiry. It's finalized at a professional conduct committee so that at least all the options can be available if a person is found guilty. But I can only say this is what we introduced at the beginning of this year and is still really moving at a snail's pace. But we can go back and say all matters that were finalized at preliminary committees of inquiry and conduct inquiry level, we can be able to gather some of the information as much as we can for the panel.
And my last question is this. I understand you'd like us to interpret the data, and we will draw on experts to do so. But you must be a data expert in your own right. And what is your view on the value of 2 months' worth of data?
Of course, when we look at the data, we asked ourselves a question, and from us, we even went further than to say, does the socio-economic status, does this have to do with the socio-economic status of the practitioners, or does it have to do with the eyes of who sees black and who sees white? And because really, we asked ourselves, if members of the public can identify 5, the schemes are able to identify 25, while members of the public can identify 11 from the white race, but the schemes can only identify 1. We really...
My question more relates to the value of 2 months' worth of data, so the emphasis being 2 months, because one has to be careful about making extrapolations which are not reasonable.
Okay. Yeah. In terms of the value, of course, this is only 2-month data. And that's why I said earlier, we're going to be collecting that prospectively moving forward and see how it reflects, although we're going to go back. But that's why I said earlier, this is what we have in 2 months. And we thought it is interesting for the panel to note this. As to what the picture will be as time goes on, or if we go retrospectively, of course, the data will tell.
Yeah, I mean, you did say that your resources will enable you to look at least from 2016.
Yeah, I think we'll try, but maybe just to go back to the question. In the nature of our business, we don't collect such the data in this way to do racial profiling. Because we just collect information about practitioners, where they come from. But I think because of the matter that has brought us here, we had to go that way. But it is not ordinarily how we would be collecting data. That is why we do not have such information.
But the data that you do have in your database will allow you to conduct this exercise going backwards in time.
Yes, we do.
And how long would that take?
You see, from where I'm sitting, knowing when we started to collect some data, I can only vouch for 2017 April. From 2017 April, we could pick up something. Going back to 2016, it will really mean, lots of hard work that has to be done, because we were not necessarily collecting data like this, but we'll see how much we can get from 2016.
And how long would it take to get at least from April 2017?
From April 2017, it shouldn't take long. Within the next 2 weeks, we should be able to have that information.
2 weeks?
Yes.
Thanks. So, of course, the medical aids say to us that they don't racially profile because they don't know the race of the health service providers. They use a system,
practice numbers.
and practice numbers that are anonymous. So how could it be that they would be racially profiling, so they argue, when they don't have that kind of information? What do you say to that? Because that seems to me quite a strong argument to say We don't have the race. We don't know the race. We are blind to the race.
I'm not respond to that.
Well, I think Dr. Pasel has already started the response earlier, because he mentioned that we cannot look at racial profiling outside the context of South Africa's history. So perhaps he wants to dive into this one.
Yes.
With specifics.
Yeah, they are correct. And to do racial profiling, they don't need to have the race dynamics. They just need to know who's contracted in, who's contracted out. Because by that...
by that you mean name and surname?
But
and
all I'm saying
address.
is that...
What do you mean?
99% of the practitioners that are contracted in, that are dependent on direct payment, would be people that have black practices, and largely black practitioners. And those that are contracted out would largely be white practitioners with white patient bases and the affluent societies. So you don't need to have a racial matrix to get the racial information, because the natural settings of South Africa will do the demographic profiling for you. Just like we say, poverty is general, but its face is black. It's by the same token. Poverty doesn't do a racial register, doesn't say, are you African or are you Indian? But we know what the face of poverty looks like. So they can come and rightfully tell you, we're neutral, it's practice numbers. And that might be true, but does not mean there's no ancillary information that they have. Those practices have practice addresses. So they would know where the practices are located. So there's other information that they have that will give you the racial distribution. I'd rather call it racial distribution than profiling. But once you have the distribution, you can profile. I mean, like I've said, there's no racial profiling of African male drivers in the US, but they are the ones that get shot most of the time. All the time.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answers your question. So, I mean, it's a simplistic answer that they give you. What they are not telling you is that we have our own way of defending ourselves from racially profiling, but we know what the profiles are. And even if you take race out, it's the vulnerable communities that are being affected, and those that serve the vulnerable communities, and that give them leeway and access to care, that get victimized by these policies that they have. Because the ones that are rich say, I don't give a damn. Swipe or get out. Now, those that care are the ones that get victimized. And accept that there would be white practitioners like the one that is sitting out there saying, pay me what you can pay me. It's not a black practitioner, but he's not doing it to a white population. He's doing it to black patients. So there will be those idiosyncrasies that we have in our society. But we should not be, when things become legalistic, they become problematic. Because legal issues can actually blind you from the reality on the ground.
I mean, I wonder whether there's no way of interpreting this data sort of benignly and looking at medical aids from what you are saying, that if the majority of those contracted by medical aids are African. Yesterday we had BHF, and I posed a similar question to them, and they said if you look at the spread of GPs in townships, that explains why the most complaints, I asked them the blunt question, why do most of the complaints before our panel come from African practitioners? They said it's because of their spread in the township and the population that they serve. What do we know about the numbers that are contracted to medical schemes?
What does he mean by the populations and the numbers that they serve?
He means that most of the practitioners in the townships see members of medical schemes. They provide services to patients who are on medical schemes. That's what he was saying.
I don't know what the dynamics are, and I'm not in GP practice, but that might be true for certain geographies. So it would depend on the location. So if you look in urban environments, that might be true. But if you go into small towns and you go into rural towns, there are GPs there, and the profiles would be different. Because it also depends on the town that you are in. If there's a mine, that's the main employer, and only management is on medical aid, then the profile of those practices would be different. The profiles of practices 20 years ago were different because most Africans were not on medical aid. The majority of Africans are not on medical aid. So what you could say is that the major income streams of those practices might be coming from patients covered by medical aid, but that might not necessarily be the majority of the patients that they see. So we need to be able to make that distinction. So he wouldn't be able to know about the non-medical aid patients that go into those practices and what their numbers are. So the key issue is that the practitioners that sit in townships have chosen to not charge their patients directly and are dependent on direct payment from medical aids. That's the truth. And that's the key issue. And that's what they use to abuse the practitioners. Now, you have to understand that when you sit in practice and you've taken the decision that you're not going to be asking for money up front because you're serving the community, basically, you are salaried by the medical aid. And for most practitioners, if that GEMS check doesn't come in and you're saving teachers and whatever in your community, you can't pay your bills for that month. And they know that. And that's the power that they command. And they can choose not to pay you. Whether you are one of the profiled ones or not one of the profiled ones. And a lot of people will tell you they wait for their legit money that gets paid 90 days after the service with no interest. So there are many other issues that need to be read into this issue. So my answer to you is that they are just looking at one profile, and it is true that if you sit as a GP in the urban environment, it might be your main income comes from medical aid patients. But it will also mean that you get paid in the first quarter, because by the second quarter, they've run out of funds anyway. But the practices continue, and the patients get served to December when there's no money. I mean, the absence of a tariff, statutory tariff, the absence of compulsion to pay for services has created a system where it's hospice-centric, and GPs are being taken out of business. Because what they do, the medical aids have transferred the risk to the patient. If you're young and healthy, we give you a smoothie and an Apple Watch. If you're old, you're just going to run out of benefits, and you may get your hypertension medication from May in the public sector if you can. That's what's happened. So care to people has been terribly compromised on these issues. And because they run like an insurance company instead of social solidarity, people are individually rated. You run out of money as an individual. It's not a scheme pooling resources. So what you have right now is just money for GEM, for those that go into administration. And they can spin off health management companies, service providers for this, that group to do dialysis for them. You go there for your dialysis. They spawn all these things because they generate money and they can build glass houses for themselves.
Are there organizations that represent patients that we could ask to provide evidence to our investigation? So patient representative organizations.
I think there are some that have been in the process of the Presidential Health Summit. There's a representative of patient organizations that sits in there. So you should be able to, she sits in the steering committee, and there are lots of patient organizations that are behind them. So it would be easy to get those. But you'll also understand that a lot of them are sector around particular diseases. I have a relative that has this disease, and I start a group, and we look for treatment for that disease. But they are there patient groups. They are not generic. You might also want to get the consumer cancer to give you evidence of health-related complaints that have been taken to them by patients because of not knowing where to go. Those would be the two suggestions that I would have. I can't refer you to people living with HIV and AIDS because the state is taking better care of them than the private sector ever would.
Dr. Kunda, may I just ask you one more question about the data, again with the huge proviso that we will take advice on this, and it's a very difficult issue, properly interpreting data, so fully aware of that. But if you could go back to your slide on the total breakdown of all practitioners, so that 185,000 divided, were broken down in terms of racial demographics.
Yeah, that is the information that I'm sharing with the Secretariat.
Sorry, I think it was the third or fourth slide, is that right, on your presentation? I think we have it, we had it.
Okay.
If I remember correctly. That one. So my thought or question is, and I really stand corrected on this because you will be much more familiar with these analytical tools than myself, but is another benign interpretation simply because there are more black practitioners, total black practitioners, that just statistically there'll be more complaints just because there are more practitioners?
But maybe if you look at this and the picture that we have been seeing, even not looking at the race, you look at the boards, you look at the provincial distribution, but you will see that it changed. But this is not the case. Although you do have more African practitioners, but the number of complaints are more against whites.
Sorry, the number of complaints are more against?
They are more against whites.
Thank you. Can you take us to that slide?
And that's why here it shows 50% of practitioners are African and 30% are whites. But when you go to complaints per race, 50% is white and 32% is African.
And these are complaints from all sources, just
from all
sources. It's
yes.
not broken down.
It's not broken down.
And so how does this then match the last table we were looking at?
They distinguish between, anyway.
This only goes to show that perhaps I shouldn't be delving into this area.
I think maybe, Chair.
What I would hope the Secretariat would be able to do for you is to segment out the Medical and Dental Board so that they do the same work but concentrating only on the Medical and Dental Board, because that's 90% of your complaints. And when you look at the Medical and Dental Board, most of the register is white, not black. So it might then, it'll flip the whole thing. And the complaints that you have, profiling is general against the health practitioners, but it's mainly against medical practitioners.
Yeah.
So I think that subset would be important for it to be extracted out and analyzed in the same manner, but specific to the Medical and Dental Board.
Can I get your comment on this, either Dr. Pila or Dr. Quinn? I mean, the slide that really intrigues me is the last one for May and June, because in that slide you are able to draw a distinction between the complaints coming from the public and complaints coming from the medical schemes. And the public complaints are evenly spread, and the medical schemes complaints are skewed 99.9% against Africans. What is the explanation for that?
And you're referring to this?
Yes, this is the slide that troubles me a lot.
Of course, we are not at the point where we are able to explain, because we just zoomed into specifically the issue of fraud. And if we were to go and look at all the nature of complaints and look at the sources, maybe we'll have a clear picture.
No, I mean, our concern here is Section 59, and that's where the issue of fraud and accounts is most prevalent. And that's why this is a more useful slide for our purpose.
Yeah.
You know? And the disparity I'm drawing is the members of the public, that tends to be evenly spread and to match probably the representation in the profession. And then on the medical schemes, I mean, that seems to be grossly disproportionate.
Can I try that?
I think it goes back to the issue that I was raising,
Yes.
that when you take medical aid, they can only profile on people that are dependent on direct payment. Practitioners that segment themselves out and charge you directly, they can't touch them. Because I've told you my service is X, and the understanding is between me and you, and no one can accuse me of fraud. You can make a judgment call that my services are too expensive, but that's a judgment call, but you cannot denote it as fraud. And you'll see the link that they'll ask for information if they are paying you directly. If you've sort of contracted out, because this is where people have opted to be out, they can't get that information. So those that work in affluent practices with affluent communities work outside these constraints. So those relationships would be directly between them and the patient, and the medical aid can't interfere with that. So the only time they can claim you are overcharging or you are abusing or you are fraudulent, it's on issues where you are putting a bill to them and they are adjudicating on that bill and they are paying that bill. When you put the bill directly to the patient, they are not able to interact in that. So it might be, that might be part of the explanation of what you see in that profile.
Yes,
Well,
I mean, I
just-
wonder what,
Can I just
what,
maybe,
what are the other neutral explanations for the benefit of the schemes that are available for this data, so that we don't make lazy and general conclusions about it. And that's what I'm trying to tease out from your side, whether you, I mean, the data obviously strikes you as jarring, but it's too lazy to say, therefore, it's evidence of racial profiling. And I'm simply trying to explore what are the neutral ways of interpreting what we see, if there are any. You don't have to, you know.
Yeah, I will not try to interpret. But I think what I just made a note here when I looked at this information. If maybe the medical aid or BHF can help us and give us information, I think, noting what Dr. Letape is saying, get a percentage of how many of the white practitioners are not claiming directly the medical aids. So that might give us an information, because then at least we have a better basis to compare, to say 90% of white practitioners bill patients directly, and 90% of black practitioners. So then the avenue for the medical aid to make an intervention is only with the black practitioners. So that information, whatever information they get of fraud or perceived fraud, will only because the base at which they are looking at, it's higher amongst the black practitioners, and it is much lower with the white practitioners. So that might be the explanation that I could perceive at this stage.
So one of the issues that concerns me, in addition to Mr. Ngcukaitobi's concern about this slide, is this question of direct and indirect payment, because it translates into rich and poor, because you won't need direct payment if you serve people who can pay you directly. You as a practitioner would not need direct payment. But that it troubles me because again, it's easy to draw a link and a conclusion between that and race. And I want to understand more about what, are we correct to say that we understand there's no relationship between the practitioner, unless you're a member of a DSP, there's no relationship between the health service provider and the medical scheme. So there's no obligation on the medical scheme to pay a practitioner directly. That is correct, isn't it?
Yes, the law was changed prior to 94 to that effect, because prior, an account would not expire if it was a proper account, and payment was guaranteed to the provider in accordance with the rules, and payment was made to the provider by law. They took that away. It is now discretionary, and they've made it clear that there's no contract between the provider and the scheme. So the only contracts that they make would be DSPs. And in those contracts, we have a concern that the professionals might be surrendering their autonomy for payment. Because in the DSPs, the medical aids prescribes the conditions to be met to be a DSP. It's not open to all ethically practicing practitioners. It's open to people that are going to follow the laws, the prescripts of the funder, and not the prescripts of the profession.
Why do you say the DSPs are discriminatory?
Because what they do, they choose who the patients can go and see. And they select from among the practitioners. And those that are outside. So you don't have your choice. If you come and see me and I'm not a DSP, you're on your own.
But yesterday, what BHF said is anyone can join. Anyone can.
You see, that's why they call it a DSP. You are designated. It's not anyone.
Yeah, well,
you see, the old system was anyone, because you contract in or you contract out, and as a practitioner, you'd say, I accept medical aids and I abide by the fact that there'll be no balance billing, I'll take the payment, etc., etc. Okay?
But isn't that what the DSP is trying to do, is to prevent balance billing?
That's not what
it's
the
to
DSP
keep a downward pressure on costs.
No, that's not what the DSP tries to do. Because if the DSP was trying to do that, it would just be saying, here are the rules. Any doctor that abides by these rules gets paid. DSP is about, we will pay Bella, we won't pay Letlape. You go to Bella, we pay. You go to Letlape, we don't pay. That's what DSP is about. It's not about if Bella meets these conditions, we pay. If Letlape meets the same conditions, we pay. That's not what it is about. It's about telling them, if you go to the one that is not on our list, we don't pay.
But is it that they don't pay, or that they don't pay the full amount? Meaning there might be a co-payment if it's a person.
When you're dealing with vulnerable communities that are dependent on getting care because they can't pay for it, if they come to see me and their medical aid is not going to pay me, what am I expected to do? What are they expected to do? Because they choose me, they must now pay directly, something that they can't do. So these are not things that are done loosely. This is about power. This is about control. This is about diminishing a profession. This is about this largely impacts on black practitioners. So I'd like to not make it a racial profiling, but make it, who does it hurt the most? It hurts black practitioners the most. Whether you are doing it as a profiling mechanism or it's a default mechanism, the lay of the land is such that it's going to affect black patients and black practitioners the most. And you cannot say it's not intended. It might not be driven by race, but these people employ actuaries. These people employ senior advocates. Nothing is left to chance. And it can't just be a default situation. They may not be driven by race, but it's an ability to maximize on profits and minimize on provision of care and payment to providers.
So when you say it's not driven by race, you mean it's not intentional profiling, but the impact of it is primarily on black practitioners because of their socio-economic backgrounds.
Yeah, because of the lay of the land. Yes. So they might argue that it's not racial profiling, but they know it's going to have an impact on black practitioners and black patients. And they are doing it with that full knowledge.
Yes. Just tell me, I mean, saying that they know that the impact will be felt the most by black practitioners, I mean, that's one thing. They may not know, but they may be negligent about that knowledge. In other words, the information might be available if they wanted it, but they don't care enough to look for it.
I think you probably haven't met them. You are giving them too much credit. And I just want to be frank. They know what they are doing. And they know they can get away with it as long there is no statutory tariff, as long there's no rules that surround solidarity, medical aids, a system that everybody understands, a common benefit structure, a statutory tariff. That is the protection. And that is how you do an open choice designation by providers. They say, these are the rules. We stick by the rules so the patient will know that they can come to us. We don't stick by the rules, they don't. They've created further things. I mean, there are horrific things where they would say to you, we're doing global fees now, we've selected you, and after the hip, there should only be 2 physiotherapy visits. If you don't comply with that, you're not going to be a DSP, and you're not going to be part of that. So they are now dictating care. They are now acting unlawfully. They are practicing medicine, and they are not registered to do so. But that's what they do. That's what DSPs do. I mean, the issue is that, and maybe we should take the blame. I mean, we are regulators sleeping on the job, and we are a profession that does not fight for its rights. And maybe they're doing this because the profession is weak. Maybe they're doing this because the regulators are not worth their salt in regulation. And because the profession is not standing up for its rights as a profession, it's not standing up for its patients, they'll continue to do it. It's no different from where we were with the state with HIV and AIDS. When they did what they wanted to do, the patients were dying and the doctors were silent. This is absolutely no different. And why did the state do it? Because they could. Why are the medical aids doing it? Because they can. It gives them ability to sponsor English Premier League and all other things that they sponsor without paying for care. It gives them the right to tell a practitioner that we are not going to pay you. And a patient on dialysis dies on their watch. Why? Because they can.
Dr. Letlape, you speak very eloquently on this subject, but I want to ask you, is it not inevitable when there is a limited pool of resources that the schemes have to ration those resources? And so there has to be a cap on what benefits and limitations on benefits that are made available. Is that not another way of looking at what you've just explained about how the benefits are determined by the schemes? Is it, I mean, if there's a limited pool of money, isn't it a foregone conclusion that members will not be able to access all of the health services that they want and maybe even require? And isn't it also an inevitable tension between practitioners and the funders, that the practitioners want to provide services, not because you're trying to over-service or because it's wastage, but because you're trying to do the best for your patient? But the funders, on the other hand, are trying to protect the pot of money for the whole pool. Isn't that also an inevitable tension?
There will be tensions, but let's go back to the beginning. Pooling. There's no pooling, and that's the problem. Pooling would mean we're all in one pool as medical aid patients. We're all in one pool as in a scheme. There's no pooling. There's individual rating. If you're young and healthy, we give you a smoothie and an Apple Watch. If you're old, we load you such that you can't afford it and we don't have to pay for care. There's no pooling. People are individually rated. Your funds are exhausted. There's no pooling. So I agree fully with what you say. But what they've done, they ran a business insurance model under the guise of pooling based on an act of parliament. When there's an absence of pooling, it's individual rating. It's not pooling of resources. It's not that we as a fund will pay for these forms of care. It's about Miss X. Your money for dialysis is gone. Die. That's not pooling. So I fully agree with you. And what we need is to pool so that we can define what we will pay for the pooled resources. When I'm saying, if you come from Bryston, I will pay 10 grand for your cataract. If you come from Soweto, I will pay $1,000 for your cataract. That's not pooling. If I'm saying for the same procedure, I can pay 3 times NRPL or NRPL, that's not pooling. So I fully agree with you. And the problem is that we're talking about pooling concept that's being run on an insurance model where people don't have policies but are dealt with as individuals. There is no pooling, and I fully agree with you. Let's pool, and that's what the scheme was before. Let's pool the resources. So the scheme's benefits that are pooled, there's agreed tariffs based on that pooling, and you are prepared to work for these tariffs. We've pooled everyone. We work on the basis of solidarity, and we negotiate with you as a group. So I fully agree with you. But anybody that thinks there's pooling now does not understand how they operate. I mean, people have been dumped in ICU. Families have been told, come and collect. There's no pooling. So let us not, and I agree there will be limitations, but let there be proper pooling. And that's why you need common package for people that are under medical schemes, negotiated statutory tariff. Then all the smoothies and watches can happen outside that framework.
Can I just give an example of some of the things that Dr. Hlape is talking about? And we assume that this entity is accredited. It's one of the entities that is not even accredited. You go, I'm happy that all of you are wearing spectacles. You go to your optometrist, and after you leave, you receive an SMS that says an optical benefit inquiry has been made on your profile by an out-of-network provider. Your frame benefit is 50% more if you visit an in-network provider. Click here to find a provider. What it means is that you have got your optometrist who is not in this network. You go there because this is the optometrist who have got your history. They've been treating you. They know how your eyes are doing. Then you go there now because it's 2 years after your last spectacles. Then you receive this SMS to say, you have gone to the out-of-network provider. If you go to an in-network provider, 50% benefit, click here. Meaning that now you are being diverted from your practitioner who is close to where you stay, and it's convenient for you because anyway, you have been using this person. But now, because the person is not in the network, you need to go to somebody else who is in the network. And these are some of the real things that are happening. The DSPN could be good in terms of what you are ascribing, but now what is really happening practically shows you that there are problems.
So effectively, when you sign to the DSP, this medical aid is going to market for you, and it's going to steal patients from other practitioners on your behalf. That's effectively what this is.
This is starting,
and it makes a mockery of all our ethical rules about advertising, about supersession. So I'm not stealing your patients. The medical aid is doing the stealing on my behalf. That's what we deal with. That's what DSPs are about.
All right, thank you very much. Unless you one more question.
May I ask a last question about this slide, which has disturbed us so much in terms of trying to understand how to interpret it? I know I take a risk. Can I just ask, so would you be able to give us a similar slide, broke down in exactly the same way, with all complaints?
Yeah, other than fraud.
Not just isolating fraud, all complaints.
Yes, according to all the nature of complaints, we can be able to do the same slide.
Yes, and a complete one. I don't think you have to break it down in, I think you had 20 to 30 different types of complaints that there were, but just a complete, full complaints, same breakdown.
Yeah, we can do that.
Thank you.
So that would include negligence, fraud, and everything else?
Yes, thank you. It remains of me, unless there are any other submissions to be made by the HPCSA, but it remains of me then to thank the President, the Registrar, and the, I think, Head of Legal. You are the Ombudsman. Let's say Ombudsperson.
Before you thank us, I hope what we may have tried to bring to you is this importance of having a statutory tariff, the importance of proper pooling, the importance of not having 101 packages. because that creates confusion amongst beneficiaries, amongst providers, and you're spending more money on administration than on what you should be doing. That those issues will not be lost. And the fact that the statutory tariff was destroyed by the Competitions Commission, and the sooner we get it back,
Yes.
the better for all of us.
Yes, I think the Commission also acknowledges the problems that have emanated from its ruling. And there's divergence whether it should be statutory or what is really necessary is a common tariff. And how it comes about is debatable.
If the funds are collected based on a statute, it would be advisable that there be a statutory tariff.
Yes. Certainly a regulated tariff. Thank you. I wanted to just express our gratefulness that you made the time this morning and you've made a presentation and you've done the research. And of course, the presentation itself was enlightening for us, especially coming as non-participants to the industry and coming specifically to dive into an isolated area. And so thank you. The session will now be adjourned until I think it's 1:30 when we will be hearing from
The National Healthcare Professionals Association.
yes, the National Healthcare Professionals Association. Thank you.